He didn't know that the woman behind the wheel of the vintage Jaguar held the power to convene grand juries, authorize wiretaps, and obliterate a man's future with the stroke of a pen. What happens when a man who believes his badge makes him a king realizes he just tried to conquer the law itself? Watch closely, because in the searing midday heat, you are about to witness the complete and total demolition of an empire built on arrogance. The Charleston sun was a merciless physical presence, beating down on the asphalt of King Street with a heat that shimmered in the air and clung to everything like a wet blanket. It was a Thursday afternoon in early September, the kind of day where the humidity was so thick you could almost drink it, and the drone of cicadas was a constant buzzing soundtrack. Judge Diane Holloway let out a soft sigh, her fingers drumming lightly on the polished walnut steering wheel of her 1968 Jaguar E-Type. The car, a brilliant British racing green, was her one true indulgence, a rolling piece of art she had painstakingly restored with her late husband, Robert. Driving it was like a conversation with his memory. At 58, Diane was a formidable figure in the South Carolina judiciary. In the hallowed, wood-paneled courtroom of the U.S. District Court, her name was spoken with a mixture of reverence and fear. She was known for her razor-sharp intellect, her unshakable composure, and an intolerance for legal theatrics that could make even the most seasoned attorneys sweat. But on this Thursday, she wasn't Your Honor. She was just Diane, a widow wearing a simple linen dress and oversized sunglasses, taking an hour away from a mountain of legal briefs to clear her head. The case she was presiding over, a complex public corruption trial involving city contractors, was draining her. All she wanted was the salty air of the Battery and a moment of quiet reflection. She guided the Jaguar through the light afternoon traffic, the engine purring with a deep, satisfying rumble. Her speed was meticulously legal, her turns signaled well in advance. Diane Holloway didn't just enforce the law, she embodied it. It was a code she lived by, both on and off the bench. Her life was a fortress of discipline and order, a necessary defense against the chaos she confronted daily in her professional life. As she approached the intersection of Broad and Meeting, she saw the flash of blue in her rearview mirror. It was so abrupt, so jarring against the lazy backdrop of the afternoon, that for a moment she thought it must be for someone else. But the siren chirped, a short, aggressive burst of sound, and the police cruiser behind her accelerated, its presence filling her mirror. Diane frowned, a crease forming between her brows. She glanced at her speedometer, 25 in a 25 zone. Her registration was current. The car, while old, was in immaculate condition. There was no logical reason for a stop. "Stay calm, Diane," she told herself, the same way she would before delivering a landmark ruling. "Follow the procedure." She signaled and pulled the Jaguar smoothly to the curb, finding a spot just past a wrought iron fence dripping with bougainvillea. She turned off the engine, the sudden silence broken only by the hum of the cruiser behind her. She rolled down her window, the humid air instantly flooding the cabin, and placed her hands at the 10 and 2 position on the steering wheel. She'd seen enough videos, presided over enough civil rights cases to know the script by heart. An officer's state of mind could be a tinderbox. The driver's actions were the spark. It was always better to offer nothing that could be misinterpreted as a threat. In her side mirror, she watched the officer emerge from his car. He wasn't walking. He was swaggering. He was a young man, not a day over 35, with a military-style haircut and the kind of tightly wound, muscular build that spoke of more time in the gym than behind a desk. His sunglasses masked his eyes, but his entire posture radiated a belligerent sort of impatience. He slapped his hand against the trunk of her Jaguar as he passed, a deliberate proprietary gesture meant to assert dominance. The sound made Diane flinch. Officer Rick Miller had been with the Charleston PD for 10 years, and in that time he had cultivated a specific reputation. His fellow officers on the day shift called him the Pit Bull. He was known for his high number of arrests, his aggressive tactics, and his uncanny ability to make complaints against him disappear. His shield was Captain Frank Russo, a man who saw Miller not as a hothead, but as a protege who embodied the kind of old-school policing Rousseau admired. Miller believed in a simple philosophy. The streets were a war zone, and his badge was a license to be the conquering hero. He saw respect not as something to be earned, but as something to be taken, by force if necessary. And he saw a black woman driving a car worth more than his house as a disruption to the natural order of his world. It was an equation that, in his mind, could only equal suspicious. He arrived at her window, his shadow falling over her. He didn't speak. He simply stood there, letting the silence and his presence intimidate. He tapped his pen against his notepad. "You in a hurry today?" he finally asked, his voice a low drawl laced with accusation. No good afternoon. No ma'am. Just a challenge. Diane kept her gaze forward. "No, officer. I was driving at the speed limit." Miller scoffed, a short, sharp sound of disbelief. "I clocked you rolling right through that stop sign back at Laguerre Street." It was a lie, and they both knew it. Her wheels had come to a complete 3-second stop. It was his go-to pretext. Easy to claim, hard to disprove. "License, registration, and proof of insurance," he barked, the words a command, not a request. He was already the judge, jury, and executioner on this stretch of sun-baked asphalt. Diane's composure was a carefully constructed wall, built over decades of navigating racially and politically charged environments. She would not let this man's transparent hostility breach it. "Of course, officer," she said, her voice even and calm. "My registration and insurance are in the glove compartment. I am going to reach for them now." She moved with deliberate, slow motions, narrating her actions to leave no room for manufactured panic on his part. Miller watched her, his hand resting on the butt of his holstered Glock, a gesture that was both practiced and menacing. He leaned in closer, invading her personal space, his face just inches from the open window. The smell of cheap cologne and sweat filled the car. "This is a nice car," Miller said, his tone dripping with insinuation. "You don't see many of these around, especially not this clean." He was fishing, probing for a reaction, for any sign of weakness or anger he could exploit. Diane retrieved the documents from a leather-bound portfolio and handed them out the window along with her driver's license. "It was my husband's," she replied, her voice tight, the mention of Robert a sacred thing she resented sharing with this man. "He took great care of it." Miller snatched the documents from her hand. He glanced at the driver's license, but the name, Diane Holloway, meant nothing to him. He didn't connect it to the federal courthouse just a few blocks away. He saw the address, a waterfront property on the Isle of Palms, and his sneer deepened. In his prejudiced mind, the puzzle pieces were clicking into a picture he had already painted. Drug money, an inheritance she didn't deserve, a sugar daddy, anything but legitimate success. "Diane Holloway," he said, drawing out her name as if it tasted foul. "And what do you do for a living, Diane, that lets you afford a place on the Isle of Palms and a classic like this?" The question was wildly inappropriate. Her profession was not his business. A citizen's occupation was irrelevant to a routine traffic stop. This was no longer about a stop sign. This was an interrogation of her very existence, of her right to be in this car, in this neighborhood, in this skin. "I work for the federal government, officer," she said, her patience wearing dangerously thin. "Now, if you would please tell me what the issue is, I would appreciate it. If you intend to write a citation for the stop sign you claim I ran, please do so. Otherwise, I need to be on my way." Her calm, precise language seemed only to infuriate him further. He wasn't used to this. He was used to people who were either terrified or belligerent. He knew how to handle both. Fear was fuel, and anger was justification. This woman's icy poise was something else entirely. It was a rejection of his power, a refusal to play the role he had assigned her. "You think you're smart, huh?" he spat. "Using big words? You got an attitude problem, that's what you got." He straightened up, puffing out his chest. "I'm starting to think I smell alcohol on your breath. Step out of the vehicle, ma'am." The lie was so blatant, so utterly fabricated that Diane felt a cold knot of dread and anger form in her stomach. She hadn't had a drink in over a week. He was escalating, manufacturing a reason to drag her out of her car and humiliate her. This was a dangerous, unstable man, and the encounter was spiraling out of control. Diane knew she was at a critical juncture. Refusing a lawful order to exit the vehicle, even one based on a lie, could lead to a physical altercation that would only end one way. The officer was clearly baiting her, looking for any excuse to use force. But to submit to such a baseless, humiliating command felt like a betrayal of every principle she stood for. She took a slow, deliberate breath, her mind racing through legal precedents and tactical options. "Officer," she began, her voice dropping into the authoritative register she used from the bench, the one that silenced entire courtrooms. "There is no smell of alcohol, and you know it. Your pretext for this stop was weak, and this subsequent accusation is baseless. This is harassment. I would like to request your name and badge number, and I would also like to call for your supervising officer to come to the scene." That was the spark. The moment she invoked a higher authority, the moment she signaled her intent to hold him accountable, something inside Rick Miller snapped. His entire career had been built on a foundation of impunity, shielded by his captain. The idea that this woman, this nobody in a fancy car, would dare to challenge his dominion on this street corner was an insult he could not tolerate. The thin veneer of professionalism he maintained shattered completely, revealing the raw, ugly rage beneath. "You're not in a position to request anything," he roared, his face turning a blotchy red. "I give the orders here. Now get out of the damn car before I pull you out." Diane held her ground, her gaze unwavering. She would not be screamed into submission. "I will not exit the vehicle until you call your supervisor, officer," she stated, her voice as cold and hard as granite. "You are acting outside the bounds of the law, and you are creating a dangerous situation." "I am the law!" Miller screamed, his voice cracking with fury. The rage that had been simmering within him, a toxic stew of prejudice, insecurity, and a deep-seated resentment of authority figures other than his own, boiled over. He didn't think. He didn't consider the consequences. He simply reacted, driven by a primal need to silence the woman who dared to defy him. He raised his right hand, the leather of his glove making a soft, creaking sound in the hot air. And then he swung. Crack! The sound was sharp and sickening, a brutal punctuation mark in the lazy afternoon quiet. The slap was viciously hard, his palm connecting with her cheek with enough force to snap her head to the side and send her sunglasses flying off her face, skittering across the hot asphalt. For a split second, there was absolute silence. The cicadas seemed to pause. The city held its breath. The only sound was the faint ringing in Diane's ears and the thumping of her own heart. A white-hot fire bloomed on her cheek, a searing, humiliating pain. But it was the shock that was worse, the utter violation. A uniformed officer of the law had just struck her in the face, in broad daylight, on a public street. Time seemed to slow down, stretching into an eternity of ringing silence. The world narrowed to the space between the driver's seat and the officer's snarling face. Diane slowly, deliberately turned her head back to face him. She did not cry out. She did not raise a hand to her stinging cheek. She did not scream. All the fear and shock and rage churning inside her were channeled into a single point of terrifyingly calm focus. She simply looked at him. Her gaze, stripped of all emotion, was more chilling than any shout could have been. It was the look of a scientist examining a specimen, of a geologist studying a fault line just before an earthquake. For the first time that afternoon, a seed of doubt, a tiny, cold tendril of genuine fear, began to work its way into Rick Miller's gut. He had expected tears, screams, pleading, a reaction that would have validated his assault. He did not expect this unnerving, absolute stillness. Diane raised her hand, not in aggression, but to gently touch her cheekbone. The skin was already beginning to swell. She looked at her fingertips, then back at him. Her expression was unreadable, a mask of cold, judicial fury. Then she spoke. Her voice was quiet, almost a whisper, yet it cut through the thick, humid air with the sharp finality of a guillotine's blade. "You have made a grave mistake, officer." Miller, still riding the adrenaline of his rage, tried to regain his footing. He scoffed, trying to project the same dominance as before, but the swagger was gone, replaced by a brittle defensiveness. "You're the one who made a mistake, lady. Assaulting an officer by refusing to comply. Now you're really in for it." He reached for his handcuffs, the metal jingling nervously in the quiet. Diane ignored his pathetic attempt at reasserting control. She held his gaze, and the full, immense weight of her decades on the federal bench channeled into 4 simple, devastating words. "I am Judge Holloway." The statement hung in the air between them, shimmering like the heat off the asphalt. It was not a plea, it was not a threat. It was a pronouncement, a declaration of a fact as solid and immovable as the courthouse she presided over. For a second, Miller's brain refused to process the information. The name, which he had read dismissively just moments before, now slammed into his consciousness with the force of a physical blow. Holloway. Judge Diane Holloway, the Chief Judge of the U.S. District Court for the District of South Carolina. The woman who had sent cops to federal prison. The woman whose rulings were legend. The woman Captain Russo himself had once called the Iron Fist in a Velvet Glove. He blinked. He looked at her again, really looked at her, past the simple dress and the vintage car. He saw the regal posture, the piercing intelligence in her eyes, the unshakable self-possession that he had mistaken for arrogance. And he saw the truth. The color drained from his face, leaving a sickly, pale mask of sweat and stubble. The rage evaporated, replaced by a dawning, all-consuming horror that was so profound it felt like the bottom was dropping out of his world. He had not just slapped a citizen, he had not just assaulted a woman. He had, in a single stupid fit of temper, declared war on the entire federal judiciary. The transformation was immediate and absolute. One moment, Rick Miller was the predator, the king of his concrete jungle. The next, he was a cornered animal, staring into the eyes of a power so far beyond his comprehension that it paralyzed him. His mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. The hand that had been reaching for his handcuffs now trembled visibly by his side. The sneer had melted into a slack-jawed expression of pure, unadulterated terror. He stumbled back a step, as if the very air around the Jaguar had become electrified. Judge Holloway watched him, her expression unchanging. She had seen this look before, on the faces of arrogant CEOs, powerful mobsters, and corrupt politicians the moment they realized the game was over and their carefully constructed worlds were about to be incinerated. She savored his fear for a brief, cold moment, not out of cruelty, but out of a sense of grim, cosmic balance. Then she reached for her purse on the passenger seat. Miller flinched, his hand twitching toward his gun in a reflexive, panicked gesture. "Don't move," Diane said, her voice still quiet, but now carrying a command so absolute it froze him in place. "I am making a phone call." She retrieved her personal cell phone. It was not the state-issued device she used for court business. This was her private line. Miller watched, his heart hammering against his ribs as her thumb moved across the screen. He expected her to dial 911, to call for a supervisor, to report him to dispatch. He was frantically trying to formulate a story in his head, a lie that could somehow contain this mushrooming disaster. She was belligerent. She resisted. I feared for my safety. She lunged at me. The lies felt hollow and pathetic even in his own mind. But Diane didn't dial 911. She pressed a single name on her contact list. The phone didn't even have time to ring. It was answered on the first beat. "Peterson," a gruff voice on the other end said. "Marshal Peterson, it's Judge Holloway," she said calmly, her voice a stark contrast to the chaos unfolding on the street. "I'm on the corner of Broad and Meeting. I've been assaulted by a Charleston PD officer. I require immediate assistance. Authorize Protocol Omega." There was a pause on the other end of the line, not of hesitation but of cold fury being processed into action. "Understood, Your Honor." Marshal Peterson replied, his voice tight. "Are you secure?" "For the moment," Diane said. "The officer's name is Rick Miller." "We're en route," Peterson said. "ETA is 4 minutes. Do not engage further. We are coming in hot." The line went dead. Protocol Omega. It was a designation reserved for a direct physical threat against a sitting federal judge. It bypassed local dispatch, city jurisdiction, and all standard police channels. It was a direct line to the U.S. Marshals Service Judicial Security Division, a team of highly trained federal agents whose sole purpose was to protect judges. It was the equivalent of pulling a fire alarm connected directly to the Pentagon. Miller, who had only heard her side of the conversation, was still confused. "Who was that?" he stammered, his voice a pathetic squeak. Diane placed her phone back in her purse. She looked at him, her eyes as cold as the bottom of the ocean. "That," she said, "was the end of your career." For a minute that felt like a lifetime, the only sound was the distant city hum and Miller's own ragged breathing. He stood frozen on the sidewalk, a statue of regret, his mind a whirlwind of panic. He kept replaying the slap, the sound of it, the feel of his palm connecting with her skin. How could he have been so stupid? So monumentally, catastrophically stupid? He had thrown away his career, his pension, his freedom, all for a moment of dominance over a woman who held his entire world in the palm of her hand. Then he heard it, a faint, distant siren. At first he felt a flicker of hope. Maybe it was his supervisor. Maybe Captain Russo had heard the stop on the radio and was coming to check. Russo could fix this. He could smooth things over, intimidate the woman, make this whole thing disappear. That's what Russo did. He was a master of making problems vanish. But as the siren grew closer, it became clear it wasn't a familiar sound. It wasn't the high-low wail of a Charleston PD cruiser. This was a deeper, more aggressive tone, a chorus of sirens, plural. It sounded less like a police response and more like a motorcade. Miller looked down Broad Street, and what he saw made the blood in his veins turn to ice. It wasn't one cruiser. It was 3 black, unmarked Chevrolet Suburbans, the kind with tinted windows and government plates, driving in a tight tactical formation. They weren't obeying traffic laws. They were tearing through intersections, their lights flashing in a strobing, disorienting rhythm of red and blue. They moved with a purpose and an authority that made local law enforcement look like mall cops. Flanked by 2 state trooper interceptors, the convoy was a wave of federal power about to crash down on his quiet little traffic stop. The Suburban screeched to a halt around his cruiser and the Jaguar, boxing him in with practiced military precision. The doors flew open before the vehicles had even settled, and 6 men spilled out. They were all large, imposing figures dressed in black tactical vests with the word Marshal emblazoned across the back in bold yellow letters. They weren't holding pistols. They were holding AR-15 rifles, and all 6 of them were pointed directly at him. "On the ground! Hands behind your head! Now!" The command was not a shout. It was a physical force, a sonic boom that slammed into Miller and rooted him to the spot. Multiple red laser dots danced on his chest, a swarm of angry hornets painting a target over his badge. The fragile hope he had clung to evaporated. This wasn't backup. This wasn't help. This was an invasion. He had spent his entire career on the other side of this moment, screaming at suspects, watching them tremble, savoring their fear. He had never, in his wildest, most arrogant nightmares, imagined he would ever be on the receiving end. I'm a police officer," he yelled, his voice cracking, the words sounding feeble and ridiculous even to his own ears. The lead marshal, a man built like a refrigerator with a shaved head and a jaw that looked like it was carved from granite, advanced on him, his rifle steady. This was U.S. Deputy Marshal John Peterson, and the fury in his eyes was personal. "We know who you are," Peterson growled, his voice a low rumble of gravel. "Now get on your damn knees before I decide to redecorate this sidewalk with your brain matter." Miller's body finally obeyed. His legs gave out, and he collapsed onto the hot concrete, the rough surface scraping his knees. He laced his fingers behind his head, the gesture of surrender feeling alien and humiliating. The bully with a badge had just met the apex predators of the justice system. As two marshals moved in to secure the kneeling, trembling Officer Miller, Marshal Peterson holstered his rifle and moved directly to the Jaguar. His face, which had been a mask of cold rage, softened with professional concern. "Judge Holloway," he said, his voice now respectful and urgent. "Are you all right? Are you injured?" Diane had remained in her car, a silent observer to the swift, overwhelming display of federal power she had summoned. She finally allowed herself to exit the vehicle, standing tall despite the tremor in her hands. The left side of her face was already a canvas of angry red and was beginning to swell, the imprint of Miller's hand clearly visible. "I'm secure, John," she said, her voice steady despite the effort it took. "But I have been assaulted." Peterson's gaze fell on her cheek and his jaw tightened so hard a muscle bulged in it. He looked from the judge's injury to the officer being roughly handcuffed, and his eyes narrowed into slits of pure, unadulterated fury. For a U.S. Marshal, an assault on a federal judge was not just a crime. It was a sacrilege, a direct attack on the very institution they were sworn to protect. "Secure the suspect and his vehicle," Peterson barked to his team. "I want a full forensic workup. Seize his weapon, his body camera, everything. He is now in federal custody." "Federal custody?" Miller shrieked from the ground as the handcuffs ratcheted painfully tight around his wrists. "You can't do that! This is a local matter!" "You made it a federal matter the second you laid a hand on her," one of the marshals grunted, hauling him to his feet. Just then, another siren, this one familiar, wailed in the distance. A single Charleston PD cruiser, clearly in a hurry, came speeding down the street and pulled up behind the wall of federal vehicles. The door opened and Captain Frank Russo stepped out. Russo was a man in his late 50s, with a florid face, a thick neck that strained against his collar, and the overconfident air of a man who had been bending rules for so long he'd forgotten they existed. He had heard Miller's traffic stop call and, seeing it drag on, had decided to swing by, expecting to find Miller dealing with a mouthy tourist he could help intimidate into submission. Instead, he walked into a scene from a Tom Clancy novel. He saw the black Suburbans, the state troopers, the heavily armed U.S. Marshals, and his own protege on his knees in handcuffs. Then he saw the woman standing next to the Jaguar. His blood ran cold. He recognized her instantly. Every senior officer in the city knew Judge Diane Holloway by sight. She was the immovable object against which so many of their unstoppable force tactics had shattered. Russo felt a wave of nausea. "Miller, you goddamn idiot, what did you do?" He immediately switched into damage control mode, putting on a forced, folksy smile and holding his hands up in a placating gesture. "Whoa, whoa, fellas! Let's all just take a deep breath here," he said, strolling forward with a confidence he did not feel. "I'm Captain Russo, Officer Miller's shift commander. I'm sure there's just been a big misunderstanding here." Peterson stepped directly into his path, a human wall of muscle and federal authority. "There's no misunderstanding, Captain," Peterson said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. "Your officer physically assaulted a federal judge." Russo paled, but his instinct for a cover-up was deeply ingrained. "Look, Marshal," he began, trying to sound reasonable. "If there was some kind of altercation, let us handle it. We'll take custody of our officer, conduct an internal investigation, review the tapes. This is a city matter." "This stopped being a city matter about 10 minutes ago, Frank." A calm voice cut through the air. Judge Holloway walked forward, stepping out from behind Peterson. She looked directly at Captain Russo, her swollen cheek a stark accusation. "You want to handle this internally?" she asked, her voice dripping with ice. "Like you handled the half-dozen excessive force complaints against Officer Miller that have crossed my desk this year alone. The ones that all mysteriously vanished from the system after you reviewed them." Russo froze, his face a mask of disbelief and horror. She knew. She knew about the buried files. This wasn't just about a slap anymore. This was about everything. Captain Russo's mind was reeling, desperately trying to find a foothold in a situation that was rapidly turning into quicksand. The folksy, good old boy facade he used to disarm opponents evaporated, replaced by a raw, defensive panic. "Your Honor, with all due respect," he stammered, his eyes darting from the judge to his cuffed officer. "You're making some serious allegations. It's a stressful situation. Maybe you misremembered." "Do I look like I'm misremembering, Captain?" Diane cut him off, gesturing to her face. The swelling was undeniable, a clear physical testament to the violence that had occurred. Russo, cornered, fell back on the oldest trick in the corrupt cop's playbook, discrediting the victim and muddying the waters. "Look, all I'm saying is, without a witness, without video, it's a he said, she said situation," he blustered. He turned to Miller, who was now standing, held firmly between two marshals. "Miller, is your body cam active? Did you record the interaction?" A flicker of hope returned to Miller's eyes. It was a long shot, but it was the only play he had left. "No, sir," he shouted, his voice filled with a desperate, false sincerity. "It must have malfunctioned. The battery died right before the stop. It's been acting up all week." Russo visibly relaxed, seizing on the lie. "See?" he said to Peterson and the judge, a smug look returning to his face. "Equipment failure. It's unfortunate, but it happens. Without video evidence, there's no way to know what really happened. It'll be my officer's word against hers." He had built his entire career on winning these battles, of turning clear-cut cases of misconduct into ambiguous situations that internal affairs could quietly bury. He believed he could still salvage this. Judge Holloway watched his pathetic performance with a look of profound disappointment, as if observing a particularly slow student failing a simple test. A small, chilling smile touched the corner of her lips, the one that wasn't bruised. "Captain Russo," she said, her voice soft but carrying across the noisy street, "you and Officer Miller really are relics, aren't you? You still think the world operates on whispers and buried files?" She raised a hand and pointed a single, elegant finger toward the windshield of her Jaguar. "That is a 1968 Jaguar E-Type," she began, her voice taking on the tone of a professor lecturing a class. "But while the chassis is vintage, I had it retrofitted last year. The entire electrical system is state-of-the-art 2024 technology." She paused, letting the statement hang in the air before delivering the final, devastating blow. "It is equipped with a fully integrated 360-degree security camera system. It includes 4 high-definition wide-angle lenses with night vision and broadcast-quality audio. The system activates the moment the ignition is turned on and uploads a continuous encrypted data stream directly to a secure cloud server." The smugness vanished from Russo's face, replaced by the same slack-jawed horror that had consumed Miller. Miller himself looked like he was going to be physically sick. "Marshal Peterson," the judge said, her voice crisp. "My phone, if you would." Peterson retrieved her phone from her purse and handed it to her. With a few taps on the screen, she accessed the cloud server. She turned the phone around, the screen glowing brightly in the afternoon sun. On it was a crystal-clear, multi-angle video feed. It showed Miller's aggressive approach. It played his condescending audio. "This is a nice car. What do you do for a living, Diane?" It showed her calm, professional responses. And then, from 3 different angles simultaneously, it showed the slap. The sound, captured in high-fidelity audio, was sickeningly clear. A sharp, brutal crack that echoed from the tiny phone speaker. Russo stared at the screen, his face ashen. The video was irrefutable. It was a perfect, damning, cinematic record of the crime. "That footage," Judge Holloway said, slipping the phone back into her purse, "was automatically time-stamped, geolocated, and emailed to the U.S. Attorney for this district, the head of the FBI's Columbia Field Office, and the Department of Justice's Civil Rights Division the moment it was uploaded." She took a step closer to the captain. "The email was sent 6 minutes ago. So you see, Captain, it's not his word against mine. It's his word against an infallible, federally subpoenaed digital witness." The air on King Street grew thick and heavy, charged with the finality of Russo's defeat. The infallibility of the video evidence was a death blow to any hope of a cover-up. There was no spinning this, no ambiguity to exploit, no file to lose. It was all there, in horrifying 4K resolution, already in the hands of the highest law enforcement agencies in the country. Captain Russo stood frozen, his mind a blank slate of panic. The intricate web of favors, threats, and lies he had spent a career weaving had just been incinerated by a single email. Officer Miller, held between the two marshals, finally broke. A choked, guttural sob escaped his lips. "Captain Russo, please," he whimpered, the last vestiges of his bravado crumbling into dust. "You gotta help me! I didn't know!" Russo didn't even look at him. He had already mentally cut his protégé loose. His only thought now was self-preservation. But it was far too late for that. Judge Holloway turned her attention back to the captain, her eyes like chips of ice. "Get your man out of my sight, Marshal," she commanded Peterson. Then she looked directly at Russo. "As for you, Captain, you are relieved of duty effective immediately. You will turn over your badge and weapon to Marshal Peterson. You are to have no contact with any member of the Charleston Police Department. A federal investigation into your precinct, your command, and your blatant obstruction of justice over the past decade begins right now." "You can't do that," Russo sputtered, his face flushing with a desperate, impotent rage. "You're a judge, not the chief of police. You don't have that authority." "She doesn't," Marshal Peterson interjected, stepping forward. His voice was cold and official. "But I do. Under the authority granted to me by the U.S. Department of Justice, I am assuming temporary federal oversight of this crime scene and all related personnel. Now give me your weapon and your badge, slowly." Russo looked from the judge to the marshal, his eyes wild with desperation. He saw no escape. Surrounded by federal agents and state troopers, his authority had evaporated. With trembling hands, he unholstered his service pistol and handed it over, butt first. Then, with a gesture that looked physically painful, he unclipped the badge from his belt and placed it in Peterson's outstretched hand. The symbolic act of castration was complete. He was no longer a captain. He was just a man in a uniform, stripped of his power on a public street. As the marshals began leading a now sobbing Rick Miller towards one of the black Suburbans, not a city cruiser but a federal transport vehicle, Diane walked over to where her sunglasses lay on the asphalt. She picked them up. One of the lenses was shattered, a spiderweb of cracks radiating from the center. She held them in her hand, a tangible symbol of the violence that had just occurred. She looked at Russo, who stood defeated and humiliated, watching his world burn down around him. "This was the first domino, Frank," she said, her voice devoid of triumph, filled only with a weary resolve. "And I promise you, by the time I am done, the entire corrupt house of cards you built will be nothing but a pile of dust." She turned her back on him and walked toward Marshal Peterson, leaving Russo to stand alone in the wreckage of his career, the hot Charleston sun beating down on his now unprotected head. The empire had not just been challenged, it had been decapitated. The J. Wades Waring Judicial Center was an imposing structure of granite and glass that housed the federal court, and deep within its climate-controlled bowels was a holding facility that bore no resemblance to the city drunk tank. There was no graffiti, no lingering stench of human misery, no shouting matches between inmates. It was a place of sterile, soundproofed efficiency, all polished concrete and brushed steel, designed to impress upon its temporary residents the solemn and inescapable weight of federal law. Rick Miller sat on a cold, stainless steel bench, shivering despite the room's neutral temperature. The crisp blue uniform, the gleaming badge, the heavy utility belt, all the things that had defined his identity had been stripped from him. They had been taken, cataloged, and sealed in evidence bags. He was now wearing a standard-issue orange jumpsuit that felt rough and alien against his skin. The arrogance and aggression that had been his armor for a decade were gone, leaving behind a raw, terrified man. He had been processed not by friendly city cops who might have offered a quiet word of support, but by stone-faced U.S. Marshals who moved with a chilling, impersonal precision. They hadn't spoken to him, hadn't looked him in the eye. They had treated him like a piece of cargo. For the first hour, he had been a whirlwind of frantic demands. He screamed for his union representative. He demanded to call Captain Russo. He threatened lawsuits, citing his rights under the Law Enforcement Officer's Bill of Rights. A grim-faced marshal had calmly informed him that his LEO rights pertained to administrative hearings, and what he was facing was unequivocally criminal. And as for Captain Russo, the marshal had added with a thin, cruel smile, he was currently unavailable. The silence was the worst part. It was a crushing, absolute silence that gave him nothing to push against, nothing to rage at. It forced him to turn inward, to confront the terrifying reality of his actions. The slap replayed in his mind on an endless loop, each time more vivid and horrifying. How had he lost control so completely? He had built his entire identity on being the one in control, the one who instilled fear, not the one who felt it. Now, fear was a cold, metallic taste in his mouth, a suffocating pressure in his chest. The heavy steel door buzzed loudly, the sound echoing in the small cell. Miller leaped to his feet, a desperate hope surging through him. His lawyer! It had to be! Instead, a man he didn't recognize walked in. He was in his late 40s, dressed in a sharp but understated suit, and carried a thin leather briefcase. He had the calm, analytical eyes of a man who was accustomed to navigating disasters. "Officer Miller," the man said, his voice neutral. He didn't offer a hand. "My name is David Chen. I'm an assistant United States attorney. A federal prosecutor." The word sent a fresh wave of ice through Miller's veins. "You can't be here," Miller blurted out. "I haven't spoken to my lawyer. I need my rep." Chen placed his briefcase on the small steel table bolted to the floor. "You can call your lawyer whenever you like," he said smoothly, "but I thought you might want to understand the gravity of your situation before you do. Your union rep can't help you here, Rick. This isn't about a suspension. We're not in that world anymore." Chen opened his briefcase and pulled out a single sheet of paper. He slid it across the table. It was a copy of the initial charging document. Miller's eyes scanned the text, his breath catching in his throat. Title 18, Section 242, Deprivation of Rights under Color of Law. Title 18, Section 111, Assaulting a Federal Officer. "The officer in question is a federal judge," Chen explained calmly. "That elevates the assault charge significantly. You're not looking at a misdemeanor, son. You're looking at a 10-year mandatory minimum." Miller slumped onto the bench, the words sucking the air from his lungs. 10 years. His life was over. "But that's just the appetizer," Chen continued, his voice hardening slightly. "The slap? That was just the event that allowed us to kick the door down. We need to talk about everything else." Miller stared at the federal prosecutor, his mind struggling to process the words. "Everything else," he repeated dumbly. "What are you talking about? It was a traffic stop that went bad, that's all it was." A USA David Chen leaned forward, his elbows resting on the steel table. His calm, almost academic demeanor was more terrifying than any shouting could have been. "Let's not insult each other's intelligence, Rick," he said. "The traffic stop wasn't bad. It was illegal from the moment you hit your lights. The assault was a felony. But those are the least of your problems. We've been looking at the 12th precinct, at your shift, at you, and specifically at Captain Russo, for 18 months. Miller felt the room begin to tilt. An 18-month investigation. This wasn't a reactive arrest, it was a calculated strike. He had been a target all along. "We have confidential informants," Chen continued, his voice a steady, dispassionate drone. "We have financial records. We have surveillance photos. We know about the tolls you and your crew collected from the dealers on the east side. We know about the falsified evidence reports used to enhance charges on low-level offenders. We know about the caches of seized narcotics that never made it to the evidence locker." He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. "We had a strong case, a very strong case, but we were missing one thing. A clean, undeniable, overt act. A predicate offense so blatant, so public, that it would tie the whole conspiracy together and justify executing a dozen search warrants at once. We needed a trigger. Chen tapped a finger on the charging document. And then today, in a fit of temper, you walked up to a federal judge and slapped her in the face. On camera. You didn't just give us a trigger, Rick. You handed us a golden-plated, diamond-encrusted nuclear launch button. The full, horrifying scope of the situation finally crashed down on Miller. He hadn't just committed a crime, he had been the final, crucial puzzle piece in a massive federal case. Judge Holloway hadn't just been a random victim, she had been the catalyst. His arrogance had led him directly into the jaws of a perfectly laid trap. He thought about Russo, about the dozens of times the captain had assured him they were untouchable, that he had friends in high places. It was all a lie. They weren't untouchable. They were just being watched. I want a lawyer, Miller whispered, his voice trembling. That's a smart decision, Chen said, standing up and closing his briefcase. But let me leave you with one final thought. Right now, you're the man who assaulted a judge. That makes you the face of this scandal. But you're a small fish. We want the shark. We want Frank Russo and the entire corrupt ecosystem he built. He walked to the door and paused, his hand on the handle. Your former colleagues? The ones you thought were your brothers in blue? They're all being picked up as we speak. The first one who decides to cooperate, the first one who gives us Russo on a silver platter, is going to get a deal. Everyone else is going to burn. He looked back at Miller, his eyes holding a hint of something that might have been pity. The clock is ticking, Rick, and right now, you have a head start. The heavy door clanged shut, the sound of the lock echoing in the profound silence. Miller was left alone with the ruins of his life and a choice that would determine the rest of it. Loyalty to a man who had led him to disaster, or a desperate bid to save himself. While Rick Miller was confronting the cold calculus of betrayal in a federal holding cell, the storm he had unleashed was tearing through the heart of the Charleston Police Department. At the 12th Precinct headquarters, a squat brick building that always smelled faintly of burnt coffee and desperation, chaos had erupted. Captain Frank Russo, having been unceremoniously dropped off by a silent state trooper, had sprinted to his second-floor office with the wild-eyed panic of a drowning man. He had made one frantic phone call to his wife, telling her to empty the safe and call their lawyer. Now he was engaged in a furious, futile act of destruction. He was stuffing mountains of paper into a heavy-duty office shredder, his face slick with sweat. Manila folders labeled with the names of drug dealers, internal affairs complaints marked unfounded, and handwritten ledgers detailing cash seizures, all were being fed into the machine's hungry teeth. He had spent 20 years building this fortress of corruption, a carefully balanced system of kickbacks, intimidation, and buried evidence. All of it was being undone by one hot-headed protege and one powerful, unmovable woman. Stupid, arrogant kid, Russo muttered breathlessly, shoving another stack of documents into the shredder. He had protected Miller, mentored him, seen him as a younger version of himself. And for what? For the kid to implode on a routine traffic stop and bring the entire federal government crashing down on their heads? Bang! The door to his office didn't open. It exploded inward, torn from its hinges by a battering ram. Russo spun around, his hand instinctively reaching for the desk drawer where he kept an unregistered throwaway gun. "Don't even think about it, Frank," a familiar voice bellowed. County Sheriff Al Caldwell stood in the shattered doorway, flanked by 6 deputies in full tactical gear. Caldwell was a big, broad-shouldered man who had a long-standing political rivalry with the city PD. He was holding a pump-action shotgun, leveled squarely at Russo's chest. The raid wasn't being conducted by city police. The feds didn't trust them. They had deputized the sheriff's department for the job. "Step away from the shredder," Caldwell ordered, his voice ringing with a satisfaction he didn't bother to hide. "This is my precinct, Al," Russo shouted, trying to bluff his way out. "You have no jurisdiction here. Get the hell out of my office." I've got a federal warrant in my pocket that says I have jurisdiction over every damn paperclip in this building, Caldwell shot back, stepping into the room over the splintered remains of the door. Now, I'm going to say it one more time. Step away from the shredder. Russo looked at the determined face of the sheriff, at the shotgun, and at the half-shredded document sticking out of the machine. A complaint from a woman whose son Miller had put in the hospital. The fight drained out of him. It was over. He slowly raised his hands in surrender. "You're making a big mistake, Al," Russo sneered, his last-ditch effort a weak threat. "You take me down, you have no idea how many city councilmen and prosecutors go down with me." "That's not a mistake, Frank," a calm female voice said from the hallway. "That's the point." Judge Diane Holloway walked into the office. She had changed out of her linen dress and was now wearing a simple but elegant pantsuit. The bruise on her cheek was a darker, angrier purple, a stark badge of honor. She looked exhausted, but her eyes burned with an unyielding fire. Russo's face went white. He had assumed she would be giving a statement, seeing a doctor. He never imagined she would personally oversee the dismantling of his kingdom. She walked past the deputies right up to his desk and pressed the stop button on the shredder. She pulled out the mangled complaint form. "You never did learn when to stop digging, did you, Frank?" she asked softly. She looked around his office, at the plaques on the wall, the photos of him with smiling politicians. "Officer Miller is in federal custody," she informed him matter-of-factly. "He's currently listening to a plea offer from the U.S. Attorney's Office. How long do you think it will take for your protege to give you up to save his own skin?" The captain sank into his ornate leather chair, a broken man. "Why?" he whispered, looking up at her. "Why all this? It was one mistake." Diane touched the bruise on her face. "Because, Captain," she said, her voice hard as steel, "it was never just one mistake. It was 1,000 mistakes, 1,000 abuses, 1,000 citizens you terrorized because you thought your badge made you a god. You forgot that even gods have to answer to the law." She turned to Sheriff Caldwell. "Book him, Sheriff, and make sure he understands he is no longer entitled to any professional courtesies." The digital wildfire started with a single, calculated leak. By the time Captain Russo was being led out of his precinct in handcuffs, the U.S. Attorney's Office had made a strategic decision. They weren't going to let the police union or Russo's political allies control the narrative. They weren't going to allow this to be spun as the unfortunate actions of one bad apple. They were going to show the world the rot in the barrel. They released Judge Holloway's dashboard camera footage, all 4 minutes and 37 seconds of it, to a national news organization. Within an hour, it was everywhere. It blazed across cable news channels, was shared millions of times on social media, and looped endlessly on websites around the globe. The hashtag Justice for Judge Holloway was trending worldwide. The video was more damning than any written report could ever be. The public saw Officer Miller's casual arrogance, heard his condescending and racially charged questions. They witnessed Judge Holloway's remarkable restraint and professionalism in the face of escalating hostility. And then they saw it, the raw, unedited, brutal violence of the slap. The image of a uniformed police officer striking a composed, unarmed woman became an instant symbol of abuse of power. It wasn't ambiguous. It wasn't blurry. It was a high-definition testament to a system that had allowed a predator to wear a badge. The public reaction was a tidal wave of fury. Protesters began gathering, first outside the 12th precinct, then at City Hall, and finally, in a silent, powerful vigil, outside the federal courthouse. The phones in the mayor's office and the police chief's office rang off the hook, the callers a mix of outraged citizens, screaming civil rights leaders, and panicked politicians trying to distance themselves from the burgeoning scandal. The police union, normally a staunch and unshakable defender of its members, was caught completely flat-footed. They released a boilerplate statement about awaiting the results of a full investigation and the importance of due process, but the words rang hollow in the face of the video evidence. Privately, they knew Miller was indefensible. He had become toxic, a liability so great that he threatened to undermine their negotiating power for years to come. He was on his own. For Judge Holloway, the sudden glare of the media spotlight was an unwelcome but necessary evil. She remained secluded in her home, refusing all interview requests, communicating only through the U.S. Attorney's Office. She watched the news reports with a heavy heart. She hadn't wanted this to become a spectacle, but she understood its power. The video had stripped away the plausible deniability that so often shielded corrupt officers. It forced an entire city to confront the ugliness that had been festering in its police force for years. It transformed her personal assault into a public reckoning. Meanwhile, the federal investigation, now operating with a full public mandate, moved with terrifying speed. Armed with the warrants she had authorized, FBI agents and U.S. Marshals executed simultaneous raids across the city. They hit the homes of a half-dozen officers from Miller's shift. They seized computers from the precinct, carting out boxes of evidence. They descended on a private security company that Russo secretly owned, which was suspected of being a money laundering front. The house of cards wasn't just falling, it was being hit by a hurricane. Every new headline, every new detail that emerged was another nail in the coffin of Russo's and Miller's careers. The slap had been the spark, but the video was the gasoline thrown on the fire, and the entire city was now watching the inferno. The arraignment was scheduled for the following Monday in the main courtroom of the J. Wades Waring Judicial Center, Judge Holloway's own courthouse. The irony was lost on no one. By 9 a.m., the scene outside was a media circus. Satellite trucks lined the street, and reporters from every major network jostled for position on the courthouse steps. The courtroom itself was packed to capacity. The gallery was a tense, silent sea of faces. Stern-looking FBI agents, civil rights attorneys, local politicians trying to look concerned, and dozens of ordinary citizens who had felt compelled to witness this moment of accountability. Rick Miller was led into the courtroom through a side door. He was no longer the snarling pit bull from the traffic stop. He was a shell of a man. Dressed in the same orange jumpsuit, shackled at the wrists and ankles, he looked pale and gaunt. His eyes were red-rimmed and darted nervously around the room, refusing to meet anyone's gaze. He was seated next to a court-appointed public defender who looked overwhelmed and deeply unhappy to be there. At precisely 10 a.m., the bailiff's voice boomed, "All rise!" The crowd rose as a United States magistrate judge, a visiting judge from another district brought in to ensure impartiality, took the bench. He was an older, stern-looking man who surveyed the packed room over the top of his reading glasses. "Be seated," he said, his voice gravelly. He opened the file. In the matter of the United States versus Richard Miller, case number 324-CR00819. The federal prosecutor, David Chen, stood. "Your Honor, the government is bringing charges of deprivation of rights under color of law and assault on a federal official. Given the violent nature of the crime, the clear evidence against the defendant, and the ongoing investigation into a larger criminal conspiracy of which we believe Mr. Miller is a part, the government requests that the defendant be remanded without bail." Miller's public defender stood up, his voice barely audible. "Your Honor, my client is a 10-year veteran of the police force. He has deep ties to this community. He is not a flight risk. He deserves the opportunity for a reasonable bail." The magistrate judge looked down at Miller, his expression unreadable. "Mr. Miller, do you have anything to say regarding the issue of bail?" Miller, prodded by his lawyer, stood shakily. "Your Honor," he mumbled, his voice hoarse, "I made a mistake. A terrible mistake. I'm not a danger to anyone. I have a family, a mortgage. I swear I'm not going anywhere." The magistrate listened patiently, then turned his gaze to Chen. "Mr. Chen, you mentioned a conspiracy. Does the government have evidence to suggest Mr. Miller poses a risk of witness tampering or obstruction of justice if released?" Chen nodded grimly. "We do, Your Honor. As of this morning, 3 of Mr. Miller's colleagues from the 12th Precinct have entered into proffer agreements with our office. They have alleged that Mr. Miller was a key enforcer in Captain Russo's criminal enterprise, often using physical intimidation to ensure the silence of potential witnesses and fellow officers. A low murmur went through the courtroom. Miller's head snapped up, a look of betrayal flashing across his face. 3 of his own guys had already flipped. The magistrate judge picked up his gavel. His eyes found Miller's. "Mr. Miller, this court is not primarily concerned with your mortgage. It is concerned with the safety of the community and the integrity of the judicial process. You are accused of a violent, unprovoked assault on an officer of this very court. The evidence against you is, by all accounts, overwhelming. And it now appears you may be part of a criminal organization that has terrorized this city for years." He lifted the gavel. "Bail is denied. The defendant is hereby remanded to the custody of the U.S. Marshals Service pending trial." Bam! The sound of the gavel was like a cannon shot in the silent room. "No!" Miller screamed, the sound raw and desperate as the marshals moved in. "Please, you can't do this!" He had to be physically dragged from the courtroom, his cries for mercy echoing off the polished wood walls. In the back of the gallery, hidden behind a group of attorneys, Judge Diane Holloway stood and watched. She wore no robes, just a simple dark suit. She made no sound. She simply observed as the system she had dedicated her life to began the slow, painful, but necessary process of cleaning its own house. The trial of Richard Miller, 6 months later, was less a legal battle and more a lengthy, meticulous autopsy of a corrupt police career. The prosecution, led by a relentless David Chen, presented an insurmountable case. They played the dashboard camera video for the jury, letting the raw, undeniable evidence of the assault hang in the air. They brought forth a parade of witnesses, civilians who had been harassed by Miller, victims of his excessive force, and, most damningly, his former colleagues from the 12th Precinct. One by one, 3 officers took the stand, their testimony bought with plea deals that saved them from long prison sentences. They painted a sordid picture of the night shift as a personal fiefdom, where evidence was planted, cash was skimmed, and brutality was a tool for maintaining control, all under the watchful, approving eye of Captain Frank Russo. Miller's defense was an exercise in futility. His lawyer tried to argue that he was suffering from job-related stress, that he was a good cop who had one bad day. But against the mountain of evidence and testimony, the argument collapsed. When Judge Holloway took the stand, the courtroom fell into a reverent silence. She recounted the events of that day with the same calm, factual precision she brought to her own courtroom. She was not a victim seeking pity. She was an officer of the court bearing witness to a crime. During cross-examination, Miller's lawyer made a final, desperate attempt. "Judge Holloway," he asked, "do you believe a man's entire life should be ruined over a single moment of anger?" Diane looked not at the lawyer, but directly at the jury. "This was not about a single moment," she said, her voice clear and strong. "It was the culmination of 1,000 moments. It was the product of a system that shielded a man like this from accountability time and time again. The slap was merely the moment his private actions became public. What should ruin a man's life is not his anger, but his abuse of the sacred trust this city placed in him." The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours. The verdict was a foregone conclusion: guilty on all counts. At the sentencing hearing, Rick Miller stood before the judge, a broken man in an ill-fitting suit. He wept as he apologized to Judge Holloway, to the city, to his family. But his tears could not wash away the damage he had done. The judge sentenced him to 15 years in federal prison, 10 for the assault and 5 for his role in the racketeering conspiracy. Captain Frank Russo, whose case was tried separately, received 25 years. The empire was officially dust. After the sentencing, as the media scrum swarmed the courthouse steps, Diane Holloway slipped out a side exit. She walked the few blocks to where her vintage Jaguar was parked. She got in, the worn leather seat feeling like an old friend. She sat for a long moment, the silence of the car a welcome relief. She looked at her reflection in the rearview mirror. The bruise was long gone, but a faint, almost invisible scar remained on her cheekbone, a permanent reminder. The face that looked back at her was tired, but it was resolute, unbowed. The quiet hum of the Jaguar's engine was a soothing balm after the storm. As Judge Holloway drove through the historic streets of Charleston, the setting sun casting long, golden rays, she finally allowed herself to reflect not on the legal victory, but on the human tragedy that had unfolded. Rick Miller wasn't born a monster. He was forged into one. He was a man whose insecurities and prejudices were amplified, not corrected, by a uniform and a system that rewarded aggression. His rage, she mused, likely stemmed from a deep-seated feeling of powerlessness in his own life, which he compensated for by exerting absolute power over others on the street. The badge didn't just give him authority, it gave him an identity he desperately craved. And when she, a black woman whose success defied his worldview, calmly challenged that authority, his entire identity felt threatened. The slap was not just an attack. It was a desperate, pathetic defense of a fragile ego. What if she had been driving her mundane sedan that day instead of the Jaguar? Would he have even noticed her? Perhaps not. The car was a trigger for his prejudice, a symbol of success he felt she hadn't earned. What if she had simply complied, gotten out of the car and endured the humiliation? The incident might have ended there, with her filing a complaint that Russo would have inevitably buried. The vast criminal enterprise would have continued to fester. It was a chilling thought, that justice, in this case, hinged on such a fragile confluence of events. The right person, in the right car, at the wrong time. Her greatest protection, she realized, wasn't her title, but the foresight to install that camera system. It was a sad commentary that in the modern age, objective technological proof was often the only shield against the abuse of power. The ultimate lesson was not one of vengeance, but of accountability. A society is not judged by its laws on paper, but by its willingness to apply those laws equally to everyone, especially to those it entrusts with power. When that trust is broken, the response must be swift, certain, and severe, not to destroy a single life, but to reinforce the foundation of justice for all. She had not sought this fight, but when it came to her, she had a duty to see it through to its conclusion. For every citizen who did not have her power, her resources, or her voice. What did you think of the judge's decision to personally oversee the raid on the precinct? Was it a necessary act of resolve, or a step too far? How do you think a system can prevent officers like Rick Miller from abusing their power in the first place? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below, and if you found this story of justice served compelling, please hit that like button and subscribe for more content.